Hello and welcome once again to the Blueprint, Canada's Conservative podcast. I'm your host, Jamie Schmale, Member of Parliament for Haliburton, Kawartha Lakes, broadcasting live from my constituency office in Lindsay, Ontario, because as I told you back in June, we will have new content for you every single Tuesday. We ask that you like, comment, share, subscribe to this program. And of course, if you can't listen or watch it in its entirety right this very second, tell your friends about it as well. They can download it on platforms like Castbox, iTunes, Google Play, and Spotify. You name it, it is out there. There is so much to talk about again, and we're going to bring back someone who's been on the show a few times actually in the past few months. Not exactly for great reasons, because the topic we're going to be discussing, not exactly something that we're very happy about in terms of the direction Canada is going. So welcome back, Rachel Thomas, Member of Parliament for Lethbridge, also the Heritage Critic. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, Jamie. So good to be with you. Really appreciate the opportunity.
And I understand you're at the Calgary Stampede. Just before we get into C18 and tell the listeners and viewers what is going on with that, how was the Stampede this year?
Yeah, well, the Calgary Stampede, of course, brings hundreds of thousands of people to the city of Calgary to enjoy the greatest outdoor show on earth. And it is indeed the Wild West out here. So we're enjoying good times connecting with folks from all across the country, being able to interact at various events and meetings. And then, of course, there's the rodeo and the chuck wagons. And we're having a good time over here.
Well, the pictures and videos certainly looked amazing. So congratulations to you and your team for putting them up, and to all the Conservative MPs around Alberta and elsewhere that came to enjoy that show.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, a lot of fun.
It's been a ton of fun.
Well, unfortunately, I have to really talk about this topic because we've had you on before to talk about C11, which was the social media censorship bill. Now we're having you back to talk about C18, which is the second piece of legislation concerning the internet, concerning this time news agencies, that the Liberals have completely made a mess of. And I'll get you to tell us a bit about what C18 is, but just amazing what the Heritage Minister has been coming out lately in the past week, especially saying, I can't believe this is happening. Why is this all falling apart? Maybe why don't you tell us about, you came on this program many weeks ago and said, this is going to happen if we go ahead. And sure enough, it happened. Why don't you tell people what C18 is, and then we'll get into the more meaty stuff.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely, Jamie. So I think what we're seeing is definitely the disintegration of this bill. We knew it was going to be an absolute disaster. And sure enough, here we are. It is. So basically, if I was to take our audience back to the beginning, Bill C-18 is essentially a bill that was brought forward by the Liberal government. Minister Rodriguez, who is the Minister of Heritage, is the one who is shepherding this bill. He brought this bill forward, I guess, as a solution to, the outcry from media needing more money. And of course, most of those voices were the big broadcasters, Bell, CBC, and Rogers in particular, of course, basically crying out, asking the government to assist them. And so the government came up with Bill C-18. Bill C-18, they said, was supposed to help newspapers. That's how they decided to put this out there. It was going to help local newspapers. It was going to help communities like mine, Lethbridge, or smaller communities across this country. Again, that's how the Liberals positioned it. When the Parliamentary Budget Officer came out, though, with his report, he made it really clear that actually this bill is really about those big broadcasters. 75% of the funding will go to Bell, CBC, and Rogers. Only 25% of funding will be left for both the large newspapers, such as Post Media, and the smaller conglomerates, along with ethnic media. So 25% then is actually about newspapers, 75% is about big broadcasters. Essentially what this bill does is it puts the CRTC, which is the commissioner, the regulatory arm, in charge of determining which news outlets in Canada are actual news outlets and which are not, which get the state stamp of approval, which don't. If you get the stamp of approval, it means that you can enter into negotiations with platforms such as Facebook and Google. Once you enter into those negotiations, essentially what you're negotiating is being paid for news links. And so, of course, what this does is it causes a whole lot of problems in terms of the independence of journalists. It causes problems in terms of choice with regard to media options and where we get our news as Canadians. It just puts the government in the driver's seat and really results in censorship in terms of media that we have access to as Canadians and the sources where we would obtain our news.
Okay, so here's another scary part. Now, not only do we have C11 that manipulated algorithms, usually getting stuff you don't want to see, and it's up to the government what that criteria is. But now, as you mentioned, C18 relies heavily on the CRTC, so the Canadian Radio, Television, Telecommunications Commission, which determines, as you mentioned, which qualified journalism organizations get that money. So who is the CRTC? Well, they are appointees of the government. So you have a bunch of Liberal appointees deciding which agency, news agency, gets this funding that's out there. How does this support journalism in any way? So if you're saying something nasty against the government, they can take away your funding because they don't agree. You're not approved journalists.
Absolutely, Jamie. And you're raising a really good point. And let's not mince our words. This bill makes it really clear that actually Cabinet is in charge. So this bill gives Cabinet the responsibility of determining the terms of this legislation. And then it's the CRTC that actually has to enact those terms. But it is, in fact, Cabinet that is able to make those decisions. And so it can actually be the government itself then determining, which news outlets are going to be approved and which news outlets are not. So as soon as we go in that direction, we are entering into state-censored media. We are entering into, government-sponsored news. Which again is really detrimental to the Canadian public. It's detrimental to our democracy because it prevents multiple voices from being heard. Instead, only the voices that the government wants to have heard will be supported by this legislation.
I think I read this recently, kind of a meme popped up. The novel 1984 does not have to be current events, right? Like this is unbelievable what is happening
100%.
here in Canada. And these TrueAnon supporters are clapping at it. My point, and I think yours is too, we don't care if it's a conservative government or a Liberal government in charge. We don't want anybody in the government manipulating what people can see, watch, and read.
100%, Jamie. That's exactly it, right? At the end of the day, as conservatives, we believe that journalists have gone to school, they've been trained, they want to tell stories, and they should be trusted to do so. And they should not have to function under the thumb of the government or any organization for that matter. And so the problem with this bill is that it not only puts the state squarely in the newsroom, if you will, but it also makes tech giants in charge of which news links they are going to pay for and which news links they're not, which then means you have the government, Google, and Facebook determining what people can or cannot access online. Again, that is a huge problem. Instead, we should be encouraging all journalists across this country to tell the stories that they feel need to be told. And they should be able to do that without any undue pressure from an outside authority.
You mentioned it earlier, but I do want to get back to it because I think it's important to highlight this again. The local journalism parts, they're the ones being hit the hardest because, as you pointed out, the funding model doesn't exactly favor them. But at the same time, the way that Google, Meta, and others will be basically taking local journalism out of the search engine, if you will, that's going to damage their ability to get their message out. And I don't know about you, but local papers don't really exist anymore. Even in small towns, it's all online.
Exactly. So you have local newspapers, across this country that function in smaller communities, and they tell the local stories. They tell the stories about, the graduates who did great things. They tell the stories about the events being hosted by a local business. They tell the stories about, community organizations and the various components of a small town. Even larger towns, even places like Calgary or like Vancouver or like Toronto, like there are local stories that are wanting to be told. And it's up to these journalists at these smaller outlets to tell those stories. But what happens is the government has now determined that the vast majority of this funding is going to go towards the larger outlets. And so really it is putting these smaller guys at a significant disadvantage. The other problem with this bill is this. Both Google and Facebook, told the government at least a year ahead of time, look, if this legislation comes into place, we're going to respect the legislation. And the way we're going to respect the legislation is by simply not carrying news links anymore. The government decided to play Russian roulette And they pulled the trigger. They knew that this was terrible legislation. They were told by witness after witness after witness at committee, both within the House of Commons and in the Senate. They were given an opportunity to fix this legislation. Conservatives brought forward amendment after amendment to help with that. We were turned down at every turn. And so at the end of the day, the government pushed it through. Well, Google and Facebook have now made good on their threat, and they said, we're not carrying news links anymore. What that does then is it harms Canadians. It means that we cannot access the news sources that we wish to access. So then the government decided that they were going to try to act all macho. And they said, well, then we're not going to advertise on Facebook anymore. Now, what they were saying is we're not going to put government announcements on Facebook anymore. So really what they're doing is they're saying we're no longer going to make announcements with regards to public programming or service announcements that Canadians deserve to hear about. We are no longer going to make those available on Facebook. That's what the Liberal minister was really saying. It had nothing to do with partisanship. It had everything to do with just the government's responsibility to make things available to Canadians. So at the end of the day, that's just hurting Canadians. Facebook doesn't care. It was 0.01% of their overall ad revenue. So Facebook doesn't care about that. It was just simply the Minister of Heritage trying to save face and act macho, but really was doing nothing to harm Facebook and everything to harm Canadians by preventing them from being able to access important government information. Now, here's what's interesting about this, is that when we asked the minister, or when he was asked, I should say, with regards to the Liberal Party of Canada and whether or not they would stop advertising on Facebook, they said no, they're going to continue to use Facebook. So in other words, it's okay for the Liberal Party of Canada to continue using Facebook for their advertising. No problem there, because of course they don't want to harm their political advantage. But when it comes to the government of Canada, things that every Canadian should have access to, well, you're out of luck. They're no longer going to make those messages available on public platforms. So that's a huge problem. And I think what it highlights for Canadians is the fact that really this government is about saving face. It's about trying to look like they're doing the right thing, but at the end of the day, they're not. As stated, this money is going towards large broadcasters. It's not going towards ethnic media. It's not going towards small newspapers. It's not saving, choice in news across this country. Not at all. And in addition to that, when the government says that they're going to, be punitive towards Facebook, that's not at all true. In fact, they're being punitive towards Canadians. So it's an absolute blunder. And then if I may, just to finish this off, the latest news is that as of the last couple of days, now the Heritage Minister, again, in order to save face and continue with his prideful function, he said, well, actually, we're entering into some backroom deals with Google. We're going to make sure that the news stays on these platforms. So really what he's saying is he's saying, but he's not saying that this was really terrible legislation. They screwed up. And so now what he's saying is he's going to turn a blind eye to significant portions of this legislation in order to try to keep Google at the table, in order to make sure that news links are still carried. He would be better off just saying, look, Canada, we screwed up. We got this wrong. We're going to scrap the legislation and we're going to start all over again, which is what so many legal experts, media experts, and journalists, including the Globe and Mail, are calling for. They're asking for this legislation to be scrapped altogether and to be started all over again, which I'll add, when Conservatives form government, we will absolutely be scrapping this piece of legislation and starting from scratch because it is an absolute disaster.
You know what that also tells me, what the Liberals are doing when they go to the backroom deals? I'm just so sensitive to what these Liberals are up to all the time that it just rings in my head. I hear carve-outs for certain organizations, for certain preferred news organizations. They will get the carve-outs. Everybody else will starve. That's what it tells me.
100%. And you're absolutely right, Jamie. And I'll just highlight for our audience again, like to show the two-facedness of this government. On the one hand, the minister is saying, well, this is about, ethnic media and Indigenous media and protecting those small outlets. On the other hand, again, he is very much pumping up the big three broadcasters and very much turning away those smaller guys. And not just the smaller outlets, but the innovative outlets, the outlets that are established online, who were able to anticipate what was going to come. They knew the world was shifting and they changed course and they became online And they also became subscription based. And those media companies have been doing very well. Now, with the government intervening, what they're doing is they're distorting the marketplace. And what they're going to do then is they're going to rescue those three big broadcasters in exchange for actually causing extreme detriment or harm to those innovative news outlets that really have been anticipatory all along, incredibly creative, incredibly innovative, and who offer the voices that Canadians really deserve to hear.
And at that point, why would the big news organizations that are getting a special carve-out from government and the protection from big government, at the same time, seeing barriers to competition introduced that keep the smaller players at bay and far enough away from eating away at their profits or even having to compete? So at that point, why would you bite the hand that feeds you? Why would you have objective journalism at that point? You would just give out government talking points because we don't want any barriers reduced to allow the free market to take hold and smaller organizations to eat into the big three or the comfort news organizations. This is a terrible, terrible situation Canada has itself in.
Yeah, again, you're absolutely right. And I think this is a big problem, right? So you already have the CBC, which receives $1.2 billion per year by the federal government, which of course is taxpayer money. You have, Bell, Rogers, and other large outlets that are receiving, $600 million in Canadian, government bailout money or the media fund. And then now on top of that, you have Bill C-18, which is supposed to create a fund of about, anywhere from, $175 to $350 million. Again, if you're an outlet that is dependent on government funding, are you really going to be objective? Are you really going to be independent? Are you really going to be able to establish yourself according to journalistic standards that have been set by many of these outlets? I would argue, and many Canadians would argue, that just won't be possible. And so what happens then is it sends the perception to the Canadian public that news outlets are just simply, the puppets, I guess, of the government. And really then trust starts to disintegrate. And when trust starts to disintegrate, then people are no longer accessing the stories that need to be accessed or believing the things that are told to them. And it really harms democracy and it sends us into chaos as a country. So the solution is ultimately to allow news outlets to function independent of government and supported by the Canadian public. And I read a really interesting offering just within the last 24 hours, and that was from the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. And one of the things that they had suggested was, why not actually turn it over to the Canadian people? In other words, what they were offering was allow for Canadians to subscribe to the news outlets of their choice, and then allow them to submit those receipts along with their taxes at the end of the year and to receive a 100% rebate. So essentially then, the money is still getting to the news outlets, but it's the Canadian people who are determining the type of news that they want to watch or read. And so they're determining the outlets that should be supported, which takes the government out of the equation and I think restores independence back to journalism.
Not how a Liberal thinks. No, you can't leave these types of decisions up to ordinary people. They might hurt themselves if they have to make decisions for themselves. Big government needs to make these decisions and tell people what they're going to watch. Show them what they're going to listen to, and that's it. They will decide who the arbiter of truth is, and otherwise the people just keep pushing it uphill. Don't worry about it. Don't make a decision. You'll just get yourselves in trouble. That's what this is coming to.
Yeah, absolutely. This really is about the state maintaining control and being able to make sure that the message that is out there for the Canadian public to consume is in fact approved by the Liberal Party of Canada.
All right, Rachel Thomas, we've gone a bit over time, but I love talking to you. There's so many more questions I could ask. I don't know. Everything just seems broken with this government. They can't seem to get anything right. It's mind-boggling how they can fail so much and spend so much, but get so little accomplished.
100%. Right. But you know what, Jamie? I think we have a huge opportunity to fight on behalf of Canadians, and we're going to continue to do that.
All right. The guests always get the final word. I don't know if you want that to be it, but the floor is yours.
That's it.
Oh, that is it. All right. Rachel Thomas, the one and only. Thank you so much for carving. I begged and pleaded to get her on, and she answered my pleas. She came on to talk about this very important topic. So thank you, Rachel. I appreciate your time, and I'll let you get back with your day. Thank you so much. Rachel
Thanks,
Thomas,
Jim.
Member of Parliament for Lethbridge, Alberta, also the Heritage Critic for the Conservative Party of Canada. Also, thank you for your time. We appreciate you that you like, comment, subscribe, and share this program. We have so many barriers in our midst right now with this government clamping down. We ask that you do your part as well. Get this message out. Eyes and ears need to see and listen to this program. Of course, you can download it, listen to it on platforms like Castbox, iTunes, Google Play, and Spotify. Next week, new content for you every single Tuesday, 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Until then, remember, low taxes, less government, more freedom. That's the blueprint.